And let's continue with Fumi.
So hi everyone. So I'm Fumi, and with my colleague Matthias, but we are both at the University of Edinburgh. We will continue a little bit of sort of Scottish stories, but we will go outside of Edinburgh, which is interesting, I hope. So our talk is on evolving multi-level entrepreneurial ecosystems and economic development policies, a transdisciplinary case studies of the Scottish borders. It's a bit of a mouthful title, and hope we will deliver something along this line. Okay, so just a kind of quick background about ourselves. I'm based at the business school, and Matthias is from Science and Technology Innovation Studies and now working in the School of Engineering. So we are kind of coming from complementary but different perspectives. Okay, so this is a fourth workshop of this series, and the theme of the day is configuration and dynamics of entrepreneurial ecosystems. And I kind of found a kind of nice phrase in the Marcus Greenwich and Marcos Sotrauta paper, recent one. And I'll just read out. Only if an agent perceives new opportunities with certain technologies, and only if the agent has the capability to set actions towards the realization of these opportunities, the emergence of a new territorial growth paths are possible. Okay, so, and in this paper, we found kind of nice sort of terms, perceived future and regional specific opportunity space. And last week, some of the presentations, Colin Mason's presentation and others talked about like a kind of historical evolution, and kind of this paper Matt and I kind of recently wrote up is sort of trying to look into the future a little bit, which is probably quite sort of challenging, but we try to kind of look into the evolution towards the future if possible. So that's the kind of context of this work. And also, yeah, another sort of context we are setting this paper is lack of locally relevant place-based intelligence, specifically in the space of city regions, which is kind of somewhere in the middle. It's not the region, it's not the city, it's city region. So what do we know about city region and how to make it relevant for decision making and sort of visioning the future? So we're drawing on a number of conceptual frameworks, including several people on the call today, and some of the speakers later. And I know some of the sort of speakers will give a more sort of critical review of the ecosystem framework. And we've had a sort of exciting talk by Michaela already, so I'm not going to too much details, but I'd like to reference. I know Bernd and Ben, both of them are on the call, so it's kind of nice to have the authors. So we are referring to the recent paper of Bernd, Eric, Ben, BEB, and this nice diagram. We didn't create a nice diagram as Michaela did, so we are just sort of borrowing kind of nice, clever stuff from their paper. So this is we thought this is a kind of good starting point, but I'm kind of rather critical about this causal mechanism of entrepreneurial ecosystem, but it looks kind of useful. Nested ecosystem, entrepreneurial outputs, and then outcomes, and then kind of makes a sort of circular connection. And there is an intermediary processes and causality in between somehow, but we wanted to unpack a little bit more. So we are sort of bringing in multi-scalar perspectives, as many of us are sort of working on, and multi-level governance, kind of fragmented governance. How do you coordinate vertically as well as horizontally? And there are a number of heterogeneous local institutions at play. So it's not just the level, but the kind of different nature, size, and resources of actors at different levels. And then we also trying to bring in multi-level perspective of complex system transitions. And this is kind of where Matt has done some work on the role of intermediaries. And we are sort of trying to highlight Michaela also mentioned the macro, meso, sort of micro level. So we are sort of trying to kind of combine the different levels, multi-level perspectives and multi-level governance. So just getting a little bit congested, I suppose. So back to this paper, the recent review paper in Entrepreneurial Theory and Practice. They've developed a nice metrics, and I kind of we are sort of using it as a sort of our roadmap. So here, maybe Ben Burnt is kind of not better explaining this anyway, but just sort of quickly, this is sort of 4 themes, vertical cross-sectional themes, and also research streams, 4 by 4. And what we are going to do today, the paper we recently wrote, is kind of focusing on methodologies, and we are trying to kind of make out of the complex systems and how to sort of understand that and how to come up with something helpful in terms of the sort of policy intervention. So that's why we are kind of interested in, so what can we do? Question. Then we are doing a little bit of sort of, critical reflection of our roles as the researchers, and then sort of contextual understanding of sort of policy interventions and how to take the sort of technology forward in the place relevant context. So I'm just doing a little bit of sort of starting point of conceptual thing, and then after this slide I'll pass on to Matt to talk more about the sort of real what's going on. But just sort of sum up what we are trying to do. We are trying to develop ecosystem foresight tool with a bit of like a kind of inverted comma, because this is not proper foresight as such, but some kind of methodological approaches to identify opportunity areas. And we kind of like that sort of word opportunity space in the Greenwich and Soterado paper. So we thought, well, let's start with identifying the areas of opportunity which is relevant in a specific place context. And then from there, we're going to build up place-based intelligence, and that will lead to opportunity space, right? So to do that, we need to kind of align the actors, sectors, and different capabilities. And then through that, we are kind of trying to elaborate how the actors structure and shape the agency in a sort of, local and extra local context. So that's kind of the broad scene setting. And I think, yeah, this is where Matt will come in.
Sure. So thank you, Fumi, and hello, everybody. I actually haven't had time to introduce myself, but there you go. So yeah, so it's in a sense, this is a take on ecosystem, which is about identifiable building blocks from ground up, rather than trying to sort of predetermine the existence of an ecosystem and then examining it. And so what we are looking at in this sort of opportunity area analysis tool is a way of mapping on these multiple levels what are potential spaces for alignment. So that's how we get to the opportunity space. So if you map out, we've had this idea that if you map out the various at the various levels what's going on, then that will generate the space for alignment. And there's 3 levels. If you think macro, meso, micro, and it's about trends, capabilities, and capacity. So trends are basically your strategic direction within a framing. We primarily use this for looking at, as Fumi said, sort of city region, but you can do the same, although you can apply the same sort of framework sectorially as well, if you're that way minded. But so the understanding, first of all, is what is the sort of strategic objective, what is the strategic view. That's how you kind of map out the trends, and you can kind of look at specific types of data, usually secondary sources, things like strategies, skills assessment, all sorts of stuff like that. The meso level is the actual capabilities. So the resources that the place sector have to actually conduct new kind of entrepreneurial innovation activities. And then finally is the actual capacity. There's a slide, sometimes people use capabilities and capacities in a very interesting and interchangeable way. Here they were used specifically, so the capabilities is the potential to do something. The capacity is actually the ability to actually go and do it. And whilst this might seem like a kind of a little semantic sort of wordplay, there is a particular difference. And we look at capacities specifically when we actually measure existing R&D projects, existing entrepreneurial endeavors, existing things that are happening in that kind of more micro sort of niche level. I think this is the gist of it, and that's why we spent some time on this slide. But I think it will become a lot more apparent as to what we are doing if we have a look at some examples from the study that we recently done in the Scottish borders. So I don't know how much you know about the Scottish borders, but it's a relatively large area of southeastern Scotland. So it's just sort of south of the city of Edinburgh. It has been sort of developed as a kind of it's called the borders for a very good reason. It's always been kind of the southernmost, a slightly forgotten part of Scotland, and obviously not, but being sort of more kind of a link towards the down south, towards England, rather than having its own kind of economic or cultural identity. It was always kind of seen as the borders. And recently, the borders and the whole of this kind of southeastern part of Scotland were part of a kind of an attempt to integrate a little bit more in terms of economic policy sort of direction through the Edinburgh and Southeast of Scotland City Region deal. And in particular within that, there's quite a lot of money given to a partnership between the universities in the region, mainly the universities in and around Edinburgh, for something called the data-driven innovation. So there's on one hand, there's an economic integration going on across the region, or attempts at economic integration. On the other hand, the focus is on innovation. And actually, if you look inside the data-driven innovation program sort of details, you realize a lot of that is supposed to be coming from some kind of spontaneous entrepreneurial activity that creates Edinburgh and the city region as the data capital of Europe. But as we just said, actually the city region is very diverse, and you have areas which have very different economic development trajectories. The borders 5, kind of all the south and the north, and on top of that, there's also kind of the idea that there should be more inclusive growth within each of these regions, and universities through the data-driven innovation program have in place as the people who should try and deliver all this, or in a sense, who should try and pull all of this together and mediate the interest of various local authorities, and of course also private stakeholders, and all of these various sort of support agencies as well. So just to kind of have a look at it. So the borders area really is squeezed between many things. So it's squeezed between two region deals as well. There's investment from the Edinburgh and the Southeast Scotland City Region deal. And there's also something called the Borderlands Inclusive Growth Deal, which is actually looking, which is investment from UK government into the area of Scottish borders and Dumfries and Galloway in Scotland, as well as Northumbria, Cumbria, and Newcastle. I'm missing something. Carlisle is its own county, that are actually in north of England. And so what really this area is trying to do is trying to use bits and bobs of infrastructure investment and latch on to some of the key opportunities for development, like tourism, like there's bits about sort of coastal development. There is a new Borders Railway that's been sort of going sort of south from Edinburgh that could be developed. Other activities could be around it. And so this is mainly kind of an infrastructural project, but there is an implication that this infrastructure is going to be the enabling infrastructure for this entrepreneurial ecosystem, which will all be about data-driven innovation.
Matt, I would like to remind you about the timing.
Sure, we've got another 3 slides anyway, so that should be fine.
Okay.
Cool. So what we did when we go in is we basically try to map out existing sectors, the major challenges and opportunities, and what they might manifest themselves as, and then from those, develop those opportunity areas. So if you think about our trends were the ones that we set out that were like the data-driven innovation, inclusive growth, economic integration. That's kind of the trend level landscape. The capabilities, we started going and basically speaking to both entrepreneurs, universities. There are actually some offshoot centers in the Scottish borders. There's the local college. There is, of course, the council, development agencies trying to figure out what they've got and what are they trying to build. And of course, then trying to identify some of these key anchor projects. We mentioned Borders Railway. We've mentioned there's a tourism, particularly around mountain biking, in fact. And so around these kind of existing clusters, we figured out there might be some specific opportunities. And those were the 5. We went a bit too far, just one slide back, just for 1 second. We've identified like 5 specific ones, all underpinned by effectively the drive towards digital upskilling and of course, this kind of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship support. And this is why actually I was very serious when I asked Michael about, like, so what should we do to intervene? Is the question really is, how do you engage into dispersed, geographically wide area, and where actually people don't necessarily engage that much with all the support that is available. And so what we've actually suggested to do through this is to create alignment around these opportunity areas to try and explore how specific projects can be built on, driven at the moment by the university and our local authority partners, that will sort of suck in entrepreneurs to go and actually engage with all the infrastructure that's there, both the existing entrepreneurial economic infrastructure as well as the support that's available. Back to Fumi.
Okay, so just sort of, quickly sort of summing up. So the challenge we found in the Scottish Plural Borders ecosystem is really the kind of limited capacity and resources, and policy actors having sort of, two deals, city region deal and growth, inclusive growth deal. It's lots of opportunity, but the capacity is limited. And this kind of a very much rural area, and it's very fragmented. The support sort of the system is kind of very sort of thinly spread out. And there's lots of challenges of sort of multi-level sort of coordinations. There's lots of fragmentation and sort of, layers of sort of, support mechanism, not quite effective. So opportunity areas, the challenge is sort of one, capability, and then combining capacity, how to kind of optimize these. And then what we are sort of trying to kind of make a point is the alignment, interspatial ecosystems. I mean, university-based ecosystems, sort of some people are sort of commenting in the sort of chat box, but universities are not there. I mean, there are sort of, 3-4 universities working in Scottish borders, but remotely. So there's a satellite campus, there's connections, but not immediate proximate sort of, ecosystem there. But this is the kind of distance sort of an ecosystem being created. And then how do you create intersectoral capabilities, which is interesting because the opportunity areas we are looking at is all kind of intersectoral. So how do you kind of, create the alignment of space? And here we just want you to sort of see our roles as external local agency, if you could put it that way, to kind of create the sort of, intelligence and kind of regional visioning with the local authorities. So it's just a small step, but this is kind of what we are trying to kind of create as part of the ecosystem sort of future looking approach. So that's it for now.
Thank you so much to both of you for the very interesting presentation. And I would encourage some questions from the floor. Fumi, just to ask you about your research. What does that mean for the Scottish borders? Because the interesting thing you mentioned is that there is no presence of any university in the Scottish borders. There's just some we could call it a virtual presence, and there's quite a few places around the UK where the situation is very similar. What does that mean for those places?
What does it mean for that places? Well, I think that's a sort of challenge for both ways. I think for the region, I think the university is a bit remote, and when we are just sort of doing interviews, it's not like, people are aware of the kind of networks, connection and support, but not something directly they're engaging with. So the local colleges are far more closer, and they kind of provide the relevant skills. So one kind of way forward is universities working closely with local colleges, kind of vocational kind of, training, and sort of, make a sort of supply chain. I don't know whether that's the sort of right word, but sort of create kind of, more kind of translating what university do in the local context. I think it's a kind of, sort of steps of change. That's probably what is happening gradually at the moment. And there are, of course, a number of sort of direct sort of, linkages with the companies. And there are lots of, innovative companies out there, but they are not quite talking to each other. It's not like kind of ecosystem as we sort of see in the Edinburgh context, which sort of Michaela sort of described. It's not like that complexity of layers. It's more like dispersed knots here and there, not quite talking to each other. So I think that's a kind of challenge, but opportunity to work on.
Thank you.
I've got a question, but
Maxi.
it's just that you made a distinction between capabilities and capacities. And I wondered if you could say anything more about the distinction and why you considered that to be so important as to have that as one of your three, you know, the key analytical areas.
Sure, and that's a very good point, and we actually hope to maybe do more work about that. But yes, so in a sense, the big difference between capabilities and capacities is that it's not good enough to say, well, we have the this is maybe like research presence, or indeed if there is the right kind of skills in the ecosystem, to have them, to just have them, it's not the same as to actually be able to use them. And Fumi mentioned the fact there's even a problem with political capacity and sort of managerial kind of organizational capacity there as well. Which is kind of more a kind of a meta thing if you think about it from a kind of an ecosystem point of view. But nonetheless, the whole point is that actually there's a difference between having a research lab and actually doing research projects in them that actually link to local ecosystem. There is a difference between having an incubator and having actual companies in the incubator doing things that are kind of in any way complementary to each other, or creating some kind of synergies. And that's actually, so it's not, I mean, it's nigh impossible to have people kind of doing things on the ground without, of course, having some enabling capabilities, right? But what we would like to identify is what bits of those enabling capabilities are actually being exploited and can be exploited, and that gives us a steer towards where opportunities can materialize, because there's clearly activity there on top of there just being presence of some capacity. There's capacity there instead of just being the presence of some kind of capability to do something.
Yes, it makes sense. It sounds like a key distinction, because if you're mapping, then you're going to map, or you're going to put the accelerator and the incubator and the HEI, you're going to put it there in the map. But afterwards, you need to know whether it's got the capabilities. So yeah, I get it now.
Thank you. Maxim, did you have a question?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, having listened to the first and the second presentation, so the question is thinking, is there an ecosystem in the Scottish borders? Maybe there's none. And is it bad or good? It's neither. It's just there's no ecosystem. I mean, I'm being a bit provocative, of course. I've been in Scottish borders. But it's all right. That's not that ecosystem needs to be everywhere. And I've come across this in Turkey a lot, because that not every city would have an entrepreneurship ecosystem, but they're all part of maybe a regional or a Turkish ecosystem. So it's a lot about the level of analysis where you go. So perhaps the Scottish border is making a part of the greater Edinburgh ecosystem, if we want. So is there a need to acknowledge that there are places without ecosystem if we go to a very granulated level of analysis, like a Scottish borders, or we need to start thinking bigger, like Eric Stan would say, well, ecosystem are in regions, maybe, or countries and ecosystem, especially for the smaller countries. Well, I don't know the answer, but for me, there's possibly no ecosystem.
Yeah, no, and there's nothing wrong with that. As you said, I think in an interesting way, I think what you're saying is a point that I sometimes raise, which is the idea that actually, it kind of depends on the frame of reference as to what you find. So if your frame of reference is Scottish borders as a region, then maybe there is that, the conclusion of this is there's no ecosystem at that level. There might be a national ecosystem. There might be small sectoral, local, clustery type ecosystems that they're tiny, that are rudimentary, but nonetheless, I mean, ecosystem, by if you look at the ecosystem as a thing, is basically a sustainable set of interrelationships between organizations for some kind of common, purpose and alignment. And what Fumi and I were trying to present is effectively how you generate that sort of alignment where there isn't one, on the scale that you're interested in. So are there other scales at which an ecosystem is there? Sure, because otherwise there'd be no people living there. Everybody would be just, either unemployed or hungry or both, right? So it doesn't, obviously that something is there, right? It's just that what, our task was, because this is where, of course, the trends come in, is, we would like to do data-driven innovation there, there is an impetus for inclusive growth. So there is a particular opportunity to develop at this level ecosystem. How do you go about doing that? Well, one thing that you can try and think about it is by trying to identify these opportunity areas that help you build an opportunity space for this ecosystem to grow in. So it's, in a sense, it's a developmental, but you're right. I mean, depending on how you frame it, there either is or isn't. You might be seeing just a little leg, or maybe you're seeing, a person inside the forest, right? That's just because of the framing that we put on. And for borders, yes, there is no strong ecosystem at that level.
Very good. I just thought of maybe a threshold, and that's Michaela's concept can be helpful. So let's say if we have at least collaboration or interdependence, if we can spot and the existence and the interrelation of at least maybe 3 actors or 3 stakeholders, then we can kind of turn on the light bulb.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of add that the framing we sort of started is really like a kind of Edinburgh and Southeast Scotland city region ecosystem. So that's kind of political creation. So being sort of, part of the university, kind of commissioned to do the research, what can the university deliver? So yeah, I think sort of in one way of putting it is, yeah, there's no ecosystem, but in a way we are kind of part of that process. And there are like a sort of tourism and agriculture kind of local past dependency thing, which is kind of also changing as well. So in a way it's an exciting place, but it's not really visible in a sort of Edinburgh mapping sort of an exercise, for instance. It's very much sparse. So it's a different nature of ecosystem, I would say.
Thank you.